Pastor David Crane never imagined that the last Sunday sermon he'd ever preach would be about protecting what matters most. But as he stood at his kitchen window that morning in 1983, watching his 8-year-old son, Tommy, chase their neighbor's cat through the backyard, something cold settled in his chest like a stone. Margaret hummed softly at the stove, her auburn hair catching the early light as she flipped pancakes with practiced ease. The kitchen smelled of coffee and vanilla, the same Sunday morning symphony they'd orchestrated for years. 6-year-old Sarah sat cross-legged on the linoleum floor, carefully braiding the hair of her favorite doll while wearing her best yellow dress, the one with tiny flowers that Margaret had sewn by hand. "Daddy, can I sit in the front pew today?" Sarah asked, looking up with eyes that mirrored her mother's gentle brown. "Mrs. Henderson said I was getting too big for the nursery." David turned from the window, forcing a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Just remember to keep your feet still during prayer." But his mind drifted to the phone call from 3 nights ago. A man's voice, gravelly and unfamiliar, asking specific questions about Sunday service times and whether the pastor's family always rode together in the church van. When David had asked who was calling, the line went dead. Margaret set a plate of pancakes in front of him, her fingers briefly touching his shoulder. "You're quiet this morning," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about today's sermon," he replied, cutting into the golden stack. The lie came easier than it should have. Through the window, he noticed a blue sedan parked across the street, the same one he'd seen after Wednesday night service and again yesterday at the grocery store. The driver wore a baseball cap pulled low, face hidden behind the morning shadows. Tommy burst through the back door, grass stains decorating his Sunday slacks. "Mom, can we take the long way to church?" "Through Miller's Creek," Margaret laughed, reaching for a damp cloth. "Only if you promise to stay clean until we get there." David watched his family move around the kitchen like dancers in a familiar routine, their voices blending into the comfortable chaos of Sunday morning preparation. Outside, the blue sedan's engine started with a low rumble. Something was coming for them. He could feel it in the way the stranger had lingered after last week's service, in the weight of eyes that followed them everywhere they went. But for now, in this moment, they were still whole. The evening light filtered through Hillcrest Baptist's stained glass windows, casting jeweled shadows across the worn wooden pews. David gripped the pulpit's edges, his knuckles white against the dark wood, as he gazed out at the familiar faces of his congregation. 43 people had gathered for Sunday evening service, a good turnout for a small-town church. Margaret sat in the second pew with Tommy and Sarah, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. Tommy swung his legs beneath the bench, while Sarah colored quietly in her children's bulletin, tongue poking out in concentration. The picture of his perfect family should have calmed David's nerves, but his eyes kept drifting to the back corner. A man he'd never seen before sat alone in the last pew, wearing a dark jacket despite the warm evening. His face remained shadowed beneath a baseball cap, and he'd arrived just as the service began, slipping in without greeting anyone. David had pastored this church for 8 years. He knew every regular, every visitor's cousin, every traveling salesman who stopped by. This man was different. "Tonight I want to talk about protection," David began, his voice carrying across. "The sanctuary. Not the kind that comes from locks and walls, but the protection that comes from faith, from family, from standing guard over what God has entrusted to our care." The stranger leaned forward slightly, and David caught a glimpse of pale eyes beneath the cap's brim, cold eyes that seemed to catalogue every word. "Sometimes evil comes disguised," David continued, his sermon taking on an urgency he hadn't planned. "It watches and waits. It studies our routines, our weaknesses, our most precious treasures." His voice rose. "But we must be vigilant shepherds of our flocks, protectors of the innocent." Margaret looked up from Sarah's coloring, sensing the shift in her husband's tone. She followed his gaze toward the back pew, but the stranger had already risen and was walking toward the exit. The heavy wooden door creaked once, then closed with a soft thud. After the benediction, as the congregation filed out into the warm evening air, David helped Margaret gather the children's belongings. Tommy yawned against his father's shoulder. while Sarah clutched her doll. "Ready to head home?" Margaret asked, keys jingling in her hand as they walked toward their white church van parked behind the building. David nodded, but his eyes scanned the parking lot. The blue sedan was nowhere to be seen, yet he couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched from somewhere beyond the circle of light. "Let's go," he said quietly, opening the van's sliding door. Helen Morrison arrived at Hillcrest Baptist at 7:30 Monday morning, just as she had every weekday for the past 12 years. The church secretary's heels clicked against the linoleum hallway as she made her way to the office, coffee in one hand and a stack of bulletins to fold in the other. The building felt different in the early morning quiet, peaceful, expectant. Like it was holding its breath, she flipped on the lights and settled behind her desk, expecting to hear Pastor Crane's familiar whistle echoing from his study within the hour. He always arrived by 8:15, usually carrying a thermos of Margaret's coffee and humming whatever hymn had stuck in his head from Sunday service. By 9 o'clock, Helen's fingers drummed against her desk blotter. She picked up the phone and dialed the Crane house, listening to it ring once, twice, 6 times before hanging up. Maybe they'd gone to the grocery store early. Margaret always did the shopping on Mondays. At 9:30, Mrs. Ethel Patterson called about the women's auxiliary meeting. "Is Pastor Crane in? I need to confirm the fellowship hall schedule." "He's running a bit late this morning," Helen replied, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Can I have him call you back?" By 10 o'clock, 3 more calls had come in. Helen walked to the window overlooking the parking lot, scanning for the familiar white church van. The asphalt stretched empty except for her own rusted Buick and old Mr. Jameson's pickup truck. He'd been fixing the sanctuary's squeaky door since dawn. She grabbed her purse and drove the 4 blocks to Maple Street, where the Crane family's modest 2-story house sat behind a white picket fence. The morning paper lay untouched on the front steps. Margaret's flower boxes overflowed with petunias that needed watering, and the kitchen window, usually bright with movement and breakfast. Preparations stared back dark and vacant. Helen knocked firmly on the front door. "David, Margaret." Her voice carried across the quiet neighborhood. "It's Helen from the church." No answer, no sound of footsteps or children's laughter from inside. Mrs. Dorothy Chen emerged from the house next door, her gardening gloves dirty with soil. "Haven't seen them since yesterday evening," she called over. "Thought maybe they went visiting family." But Helen knew better. The Cranes didn't have family within 500 miles, and David would never miss a Monday morning without calling. She pressed her face to the front window, cupping her hands against the glass. The living room looked exactly as it always did. Margaret's knitting basket beside the couch, Tommy's baseball glove on the coffee table. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing, nothing except the family itself. Sheriff Bill Morton set down his coffee mug and looked across his desk at Helen Morrison, whose hands trembled as she clutched her purse strap. In 32 years of law enforcement, he'd learned to read worry in people's faces, and Helen's expression carried the kind of fear that came from knowing something was deeply wrong. "Now, Helen, let's go through this again," Morton said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "When did you last see the Crane family?" "Sunday evening service. They left in their van around 8:30. Helen's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white. David seemed agitated during his sermon, kept looking toward the back of the church. Deputy Lisa Hayes leaned forward from her chair by the window. "Agitated how?" "Like he was watching for something. Or someone." Helen paused. "There was a stranger there, man in a baseball cap, sat in the back pew, left before the service ended." Morton exchanged glances with Hayes. In a town of 1,200 people, strangers stood out like neon signs. "Can you describe him?" "Dark jacket, pale eyes. Never seen him before in my life, and I know everyone who comes through those church doors." An hour later, Morton stood in the Crane family's kitchen, his boots creaking against the linoleum. Everything looked normal. Breakfast dishes in the sink, Sarah's coloring book open on the table, Tommy's homework stacked neatly beside Margaret's recipe box. Too normal, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never return. Hayes emerged from upstairs. "Beds are made, clothes still in closets. Toothbrushes and Margaret's purse are gone, but everything else looks untouched. Back at the church, they found the van's usual parking spot empty, tire marks leading toward the main road. Morton crouched beside the asphalt, studying the faint impressions. Looks like they left in a hurry. Tires spun a bit here. Sheriff? Hayes called from near the church building. Found something. She held up a small white button, the kind that belonged on a child's dress shirt. Caught on this rosebush by the back door. Morton turned the button over in his palm. It could have come from Tommy's Sunday shirt, or from any of a dozen other children who played in the churchyard. But something about finding it there, torn free and left behind, made his stomach tighten. Start calling other churches in the county, he told Hayes. See if anyone remembers a man in a baseball cap showing up to services recently. As they drove back toward town, Morton couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Whatever had happened to the Crane family, it hadn't started Sunday night. It had been building for much longer. The coffee at Miller's Diner had grown cold, but nobody seemed to notice. For 3 days, the same group had gathered in the corner booth. Ethel Patterson, Bob Henley from the hardware store, and Frank Morrison, Helen's husband. Their voices carried across the vinyl seats and checkered floor, weaving theories that grew more elaborate with each telling. I'm telling you, something wasn't right with David lately, Ethel whispered, leaning forward until her silver hair nearly touched the sugar dispenser. My Vernon heard him on the phone last Tuesday, arguing with someone about money. Bob stirred, his coffee absently. Could have been the mortgage company. Everyone knows pastors don't make much. Or gambling debts, Frank added, his voice dropping lower. I heard from my cousin in Springfield that there's been some high-stakes poker games running out of that truck stop on Highway 67. Across town, the church elders had called an emergency meeting in the fellowship hall. Helen sat at the long table, watching the men who'd known David for 8 years suddenly transform him into a stranger. Elder Robert Mathis shuffled through financial records, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The church account shows some irregularities, Mathis announced, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant authority. 3 withdrawals of $500 each, all in the past month. David signed for them, but there's no notation about what they were for. That doesn't mean anything criminal, protested Elder Jim Walsh, but his defense sounded hollow even to himself. Maybe they just left, suggested younger Elder Mark Stevens. Started over somewhere new, wouldn't be the first pastor to burn out. And disappear. Helen's hands clenched in her lap. These men had shared Sunday dinners with the Cranes, had watched Tommy take his first communion and Sarah sing in the children's choir. Now they were dismantling David's reputation like vultures, picking at bones. You didn't see his face Sunday night, she said quietly. He was scared, really scared, not guilty, scared. The room fell silent. Outside, a car door slammed and everyone turned toward the sound. But it was just Mrs. Chen delivering a casserole. To the church kitchen, one of dozens that had appeared since the disappearance, offerings from a community that didn't know how else to help. Mathis cleared his throat. We need to consider the possibility that David was involved in something unsavory. The timing, the missing money, that strange behavior Helen mentioned. You're talking about a man who never missed a hospital visit, who gave his last $20 to the food pantry, Helen snapped. David Crane didn't run away from anything. Someone took them. But as she looked around the table at the doubt in their eyes, Helen realized that the truth might be the first casualty of fear. 12 years had weathered Sheriff Bill Morton's face into something resembling old leather, but his eyes still carried the weight of the Crane case like stones in his pockets. He sat across from his replacement, Sheriff Amanda Cross, in the same office where he'd first heard Helen Morrison's worried voice back in 1983. File's all yours now, Morton said, sliding the thick manila folder across the desk. 347 pages of dead ends and false leads. Amanda opened the folder, scanning the faded photographs of David, Margaret, Tommy, and Sarah. The children would be 20 and 18 now, if they were still alive. Do you really think they're dead? I think a family doesn't just vanish into thin air without leaving a trace, Morton replied, his voice heavy with resignation. We searched every back road within 100 miles, followed up on every tip from here to Missouri. That van never surfaced, neither did they. The memorial service that afternoon drew nearly 300 people to Hillcrest Baptist, more than had ever attended a regular Sunday service. Helen Morrison, now greying and using a cane, sat in the second pew where Margaret used to hold her. Children during sermons. The church had gone through 2 pastors since David's disappearance, but neither had managed to fill the emptiness that still echoed in the sanctuary. Elder Robert Mathis, his hair now completely white, stood at the pulpit, where David had delivered his final sermon about protection. "We gather today not to mourn the dead, but to remember the living. The way David's laughter filled this building, how Margaret's kindness touched every heart, the joy that Tommy and Sarah brought to our Sunday mornings." But even as he spoke, the careful words of remembrance, the unspoken questions hung in the air like smoke. Had David really taken church money? Had the family simply chosen to disappear? Or had something darker claimed them on that quiet Sunday night 12 years ago? Amanda Cross stood at the back of the church, studying the faces of the congregation. Morton had taught her that sometimes the truth hid in plain sight, wearing familiar faces and Sunday clothes. She watched Mattis's hands tremble slightly as he spoke, noticed how certain long-time members avoided eye contact when they filed past the memorial table. After the service, as the crowd dispersed into the late afternoon sunlight, Amanda approached. "Helen, Mrs. Morrison, I'd like to reopen the case. Look at it with fresh eyes." Helen stopped walking, her cane planted firmly on the church steps. "You think you'll find something Bill missed?" "I think," Amanda said carefully, "that 12 years changes people, makes them remember things differently, makes them willing to talk about secrets they once kept." Helen's eyes moved to the memorial flowers arranged around the church sign. "Then you better start with the people who were here that last Sunday, the ones who are still alive to tell their stories." The old Hillcrest Baptist Church stood like a monument to abandonment in 2018, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the weathered siding. Weeds had claimed the parking lot where the Crane family's van once sat, and the stained glass windows that had cast jeweled light across Sunday congregations now stared dark and empty at the street. Jake Sullivan pulled his silver pickup truck to the curb and stepped out, clipboard in hand, and steel-toed boots crunching through the gravel. At 38, he'd built half the new developments in 3 counties, but this property felt different, heavier, like it was holding on to something it didn't want to let go. The church had been abandoned since 1998, when the dwindling congregation finally merged with First Methodist downtown. 15 years of neglect had taken their toll, but Sullivan could see past the decay to the prime real estate underneath. 2 acres on the edge of town, perfect for the senior living complex his investors had in mind. That evening, the town hall. Meeting drew a crowd that hadn't gathered for municipal business in years. Helen Morrison sat in the front row, now 79, and still sharp as a tack, her walking cane propped against her chair. Behind her, familiar faces from the old congregation, mixed with newer residents who knew the church only as the creepy building their kids dared each other to approach on Halloween. The proposed development would provide 36 units of affordable senior housing, Sullivan explained, his voice carrying easily across the packed room. The existing structure would be demolished, the ground cleared, and properly prepared. For construction, Councilmember Patricia Wells leaned forward. "What about the historical significance? That church has been part of this community for 60 years. A community that's moved on," Sullivan replied. "The building's been empty for 2 decades. It's time to make the land useful again." Helen's voice cut through the murmur of discussion, like a blade. "That church holds memories that aren't ready to be bulldozed." The room fell quiet. Everyone knew Helen's story, knew about the family that had disappeared from that very building 35 years ago. The case that Amanda Cross had never officially closed even after Morton's retirement. Sullivan softened his tone. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand the sentimental value, but we can't let the past prevent progress. The town needs development, jobs, tax revenue." "The past," Helen said slowly, rising from her chair with dignity that belied her age, "has a way of revealing itself when you start digging in the wrong places." Something in her voice made Sullivan's pen pause over his notes. Outside, wind rattled the windows of the municipal building, and several people glanced toward the darkness beyond the glass. The vote was scheduled for next month, but Sullivan found himself wondering what exactly might be buried beneath 35 years of silence. The excavator's steel teeth bit into the earth behind the old chapel at precisely 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the town council had voted to approve Sullivan's development plan. Foreman Mike Castellanos had been digging foundations for 20 years, and the rhythm of the work usually soothed him, the steady diesel rumble, the satisfying crunch of metal through soil. But when the bucket scraped against something that wasn't dirt or rock, the sound made his teeth ache. "Hold up, Jimmy," he called to the operator, waving his hand in the air. The machine shuddered to a stop, leaving an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against Castellanos' eardrums. He jumped down into the shallow excavation, boots squelching in the damp earth. What he'd first thought was a buried septic tank revealed itself as something else entirely. White metal streaked with rust, curved like the roof of a vehicle. His stomach dropped as he brushed away more soil with his gloved hands. The faded blue lettering was still visible along the side. Hillcrest Baptist Church. "Jesus Christ," whispered Jimmy from the excavator cab. "Mike, is that—" Castellanos was already reaching for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. 35 years of small-town rumors and whispered theories had just clawed their way out of the ground, and suddenly the morning air felt too thin to breathe. Sheriff Amanda Cross arrived within minutes, her cruiser's lights painting the construction site in alternating red and blue. At 56, she'd seen her share of crime scenes, but something about this felt different, personal. She'd been carrying the Crane case file in her head for over 2 decades. "Nobody touches anything else," she ordered, securing the perimeter with yellow tape. "Mike, I need you and your crew to stay available for statements." The forensics team from the county arrived by noon, led by Dr. Sarah Kim, whose careful hands had uncovered secrets from soil before. She worked slowly around the buried van, photographing each layer of earth as it was removed, documenting 35 years of evidence that had been waiting in the dark. "Sheriff," Dr. Kim called softly as the van's rear doors became visible, "we're going to need more time and more people." Amanda Cross stood at the edge of the excavation, watching as the white church van emerged from its earthen grave like a resurrection. Through the dirt-streaked rear window, she could see shadows that had once been shapes, forms that had once been a family. Helen Morrison had been right all along. Something had been buried here, and now it was finally time to learn the truth about what happened on that Sunday night in 1983. Dr. Sarah Kim's latex gloves snapped against her wrists as she leaned over the examination table, her voice steady despite the weight of what lay before her. The county forensics lab had seen its share of difficult cases, but 35-year-old evidence carried a particular kind of gravity, the accumulated sorrow of decades. 4 victims, she reported to Sheriff Cross, who stood with her arms crossed, notebook ready. Adult male, adult female, 2 children, based on dental records and clothing remnants consistent with the Crane family. Amanda's pen hovered over the paper. Cause of death? Blunt force trauma to all 4 skulls. Based on the fracture patterns, I'd say a heavy instrument, possibly a tire iron or similar tool. Dr. Kim's voice remained clinical, but her eyes softened. The children were likely unconscious when it happened. They wouldn't have suffered long. The community center had been transformed into a makeshift command post, with bulletin boards covered in timelines, photographs, and witness statements. Amanda surveyed the room as the investigation team assembled. State detectives, FBI consultants, and local officers who'd grown up hearing stories about the disappeared pastor's family. Helen Morrison sat in the front row of folding chairs, her cane resting against her leg, and her eyes focused on the evidence board. At 86, she'd waited longer than most people waited for anything. But vindication carried its own bitter taste. The van was buried approximately 6 feet down, Detective Ray Foster explained to the assembled group. Covered with lime and dirt, then carefully concealed. This wasn't a panic burial, it was planned, methodical. "How long after the disappearance?" asked Agent Martinez from the State Bureau. "Based on decomposition and soil analysis, within 24 to 48 hours of death. Whoever did this had access to heavy equipment and knew the church grounds well enough to work without being seen. Amanda stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of every face looking back at her. These people had lived with questions. For 35 years, had watched their community tear itself apart with suspicion and whispered accusations. "We're treating this as an active homicide investigation," she announced. "Everything changes now. This isn't about a missing family anymore. It's about 4 murders and whoever covered them up." From the back of the room, Elder Robert Mathis shifted in his chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests. At 81, he was one of the few surviving church elders from 1983, and Amanda noticed how his face had gone pale during the forensics briefing. "Mr. Mathis," she called out, "I'll need to speak with you again, soon." His nod was barely perceptible, but something in his eyes suggested that 35 years of keeping secrets had finally become too heavy to carry. The church financial records from 1983 spread across Amanda's desk like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for 35 years. Detective Foster sat across from her, reading glasses perched on his nose as he traced columns of faded numbers with his finger. "Here," he said, tapping a ledger entry. 3 separate withdrawals of $500 each, all signed by David Crane, but look at this. Amanda leaned forward, studying the careful handwriting. Below David's signature on each withdrawal slip was a second signature, countersigning as required by church policy for amounts over $200. Robert Mathis, church treasurer. Helen was right about the money irregularities, Foster continued. But she had it backwards. David wasn't stealing from the church, he was being forced to withdraw it. At Shady Oaks Nursing Home, Amanda found Mathis in the activities room, his arthritic hands slowly working a jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse. The years had reduced him to a frail shadow of the imposing elder who'd once controlled church finances with an iron fist. "Mr. Mathis," Amanda said, settling into the chair beside him, "we need to talk about 1983. His hands stilled over the puzzle pieces. "I've been expecting you." "The money David withdrew, it wasn't for gambling or debts, was it?" Mathis's voice came out as a whisper. "He found the books, the real books I kept hidden in the church basement. $23,000 skimmed from building fund donations over 4 years. Amanda felt the pieces clicking into place. "He confronted you, said he'd have to report it to the congregation, to the police." Mathis's eyes remained fixed on the puzzle. "I begged him to let me pay it back quietly. But David was an honest man. Said the church deserved the truth, so you killed him. I killed them all." The words came out flat, empty of emotion. "Met them in the parking lot after Sunday service. Told David I wanted to discuss terms. Margaret stayed in the van with the children while we talked." Amanda's pen moved steadily across her notepad, recording a confession 35 years in. "The making. I had the tire iron in my car. Just meant to scare him, make him understand what exposure would cost me, my reputation, my business, everything." Mathis picked up a puzzle piece and set it down in the wrong place. But he wouldn't listen. Said some things were more important than protecting people's feelings. And the burial. "My construction company had equipment stored behind the church. Took me all night to dig deep enough." His voice cracked. "I told myself they were already gone, that hiding them couldn't make it worse." Amanda closed her notebook and looked at the broken man who'd carried 4 murders in his heart for over 3 decades. "Robert Mathis, you're under arrest." The fluorescent lights in the county jail's medical unit hummed like dying insects above. Robert Mathis's hospital bed. The stroke had come 3 days after his arrest, as if his body had finally decided to surrender the fight his conscience had been waging for 35 years. District Attorney Caroline Webb sat beside Sheriff Cross, both women watching the monitors that tracked the final rhythms of a killer's heart. "The doctors say hours, maybe less," Dr. Patterson murmured from the doorway. "If you're going to get a complete statement, it needs to be now." Mathis's eyes fluttered open as Amanda leaned closer, the recording device small and black on the bedside table. His voice came out like paper tearing, each word an effort that seemed to cost him something vital. "There's more," he wheezed. "Others who knew." Amanda exchanged glances with Webb. "Who else, Robert?" "Frank Morrison. Helen's husband. Mathis's. Chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. He helped me move the van, told him it was already too late to save them, that we had to protect the church's reputation. The revelation hit Amanda like a physical blow. Frank Morrison had been one of the most vocal searchers in those first weeks, had comforted his wife Helen through years of wondering and grief, all while knowing exactly where the family lay buried. "Frank's been dead 8 years," Webb said, quietly. "Cancer took him in 2010. Mathis nodded weakly. Confessed to me on his deathbed. Said he'd carried the guilt every day, watching Helen search for answers he could have given her. Anyone else? No. Matis's eyes closed. Just the two of us. Frank never wanted any part of it, but I convinced him that exposure would destroy everything, the church, our families, the whole community." Amanda leaned back in her chair, processing decades of deception. "Why now, Robert? Why confess after all these years?" A tear leaked from the corner of Mathis's eye, trailing down his cheek like a silver thread. "Because I've been dying slowly for 35 years, every Sunday, sitting in those pews, listening to sermons about forgiveness and redemption, while knowing what I'd done." His breathing grew more labored. "That little girl, Sarah, she looked just like my granddaughter. Same age, same smile. I see her face every night when I close my eyes." The heart monitor's steady beeping began to slow, each pulse stretching longer than the last. "I thought I was protecting something sacred," Mathis whispered. "But I destroyed it instead. Destroyed everything." Outside the medical unit's window, dawn was breaking over the same hills where the Crane family had once called home, and Amanda realized that sometimes justice came not as victory, but as a final, terrible accounting. The memorial garden occupied the exact spot where the church van had been buried for 35 years. 4 white granite stones marked the graves of David, Margaret, Tommy, and Sarah Crane. Their names carved deep enough to last generations. Honeysuckle vines climbed a simple wooden arbor nearby, their sweet fragrance carried on the autumn breeze that rustled through the oak trees planted in the family's memory. Helen Morrison stood at the edge of the garden, her great-niece's hand steady on her arm. At 87, she'd outlived most of her doubts and all of her questions, but seeing the memorial stones somehow made the loss feel both final and peaceful. "I kept telling everyone they'd come home," she said softly. "I just never imagined this was how." Amanda Cross watched from a respectful distance as family members and former church members gathered for the dedication ceremony. David's younger brother had driven in from Oregon, his hair grey now, but his eyes still carrying the same gentle intensity that had marked the pastor. Margaret's sister clutched a faded photograph of the 4 of them at last Easter, taken just weeks before they disappeared. The new pastor, a young woman named Rebecca Chen, stepped forward to speak. The rebuilt Hillcrest Baptist Church stood behind her, its fresh white siding and clear windows a testament to the community's determination to reclaim something sacred from tragedy. "We gather not to mourn what was lost," Pastor Chen began, "but to celebrate what endures. Love endures, memory endures, justice, even when delayed, endures." In the crowd, Amanda spotted faces she'd come to know over the past year: Detective Foster, Dr. Kim from Forensics, even Jake Sullivan, who donated the memorial garden space instead of building his senior complex. The investigation had changed. Everyone it touched, revealing not just the truth about one family's fate, but the complex ways that secrets could poison a community. As the ceremony concluded and people began to drift away, Amanda approached the memorial stones. 4 lives cut short by greed and fear, but somehow their story had ultimately brought healing rather than division. Robert Mathis had died in custody 6 months ago, taking his guilt with him, but the truth he'd finally spoken had set everyone else free. A child's laughter echoed from the church playground nearby where Sunday school was just letting out. New families, new children, new chances for joy in a place that had known too much sorrow. Helen Morrison placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on Sarah's stone, then straightened with the careful dignity of someone who'd finally found peace. "They're home now," she whispered to the wind, and for the first time in 35 years that felt true.